study of agriculture in York, and has really kind of divided the history of York County into three areas. This idea of early diversified small-scale production in the late 18th and early 19th century, the rise of mechanization during the 19th century, and then she defines this area between about 1885 and 1940 as diversified small-scale farming, poultry raising, and cannery crops. And that's really the area we're going to be focusing on tonight, this last category. Quickly on poultry. By 1920, this area of York County was known as the Poultry, Dairy, and Canning Crop Region. We see that in the agricultural journals and the like. Poultry production increased greatly from 1880 up to about 1930. So the average farm went up to almost 200 hens when the rest of the state was at about 78. So there was a lot of poultry activity in this part of the state. And if you're driving around the area in York County and you see these barns with all these windows, those were actually originally solid barns that were then opened up for poultry production. So that's kind of going on at the same time as canning. But between 1920 and 1930, for example, the vegetable crop, the canning crop in York County, doubled in size from 4,000 to 8,000 acres, making York County really the second largest production of canning crops in Pennsylvania. The crops, of course, were very labor intensive, and labor is something we'll talk about tonight, but they did offer a really high per acre yield, so a good rate of return for local farmers. Generally, farming or canning companies either owned their own acreage or they contracted for cannery crops from farmers who were growing, and often it was a little bit of both. This is a piece out of the Stewartstown News where J.M. Smith, who is actually not, the M is not correct, but saying he wants 300 acres of sugar corn because he's starting to run a canning house at Wiley Station, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So by 1902, we've got a list showing in our area, we've got a canning house in Delta, 2 in Stewartstown, and one called the York Packing Company, which had a York location, but also had a location maybe in Laurel over along the railroad. By 1914, this is all of the canneries in York County, and the interesting thing is, if you look at where they are, 14 of the 18 are in southeastern York County. So 78% of all the canneries in the county are right in our vicinity, in our area. So we really are the focal point. By 1947, right after the end of the Second World War, we get numbers so that you can see that York County canners are shipping something like over 1 million cases of peas, and a case has 24 cans in it, so you can start to get a sense of what the volume is of this. And by 1948, there's still 12 active canning houses in York County, and we'll kind of look at some of those as we go along. Even by 1960, there are still a number of firms. There's been some consolidation of the canning industry, but we have Snyder's, James T. Smith is still going, and Fawn Grove, of course, Charles Schanberger right here in Stewartstown, Charles Summers over in New Freedom, and then Weinbrenner in Hanover. So the factors involved in the growth of the canning industry, why here, why in southern York County? So it's several things. First, the introduction of railroads to this part of the world between about 1876 and 1906. Second, we'll talk about the introduction of something called the sanitary can, which revolutionized the canning industry between about 1898 and 1904. We'll talk about the demand that was raised by the 2 world wars, World War I and World War II. And then finally, talk a little bit about the grocery store chains, the growth of grocery store chains, i.e. places like A&P, and the rise of supermarkets in the early part of the 20th century. So this is a graph of the number of cases of canned goods, fruits and vegetables. So you can really see there's kind of a slow growth from about 1870 up to really right in the beginning of the 20th century, and then just this phenomenal, starting right at about World War I, this phenomenal growth that we see here, and we'll talk a little bit about why that growth happens. So the introduction of the railroads, of course, we get the Peach Bottom Railroad from Delta to York begins operation in 1876. Stewartstown Railroad from Stewartstown to New Freedom, which connects to the Northern Central, 1885. The Maryland Central, which now connects the Peach Bottom Railroad from Delta all the way down to Baltimore, and then the New Park and Fawn Grove Railroad in 1906. And again, you guys know the map well, but the Ma and Pa working from York down to Baltimore. We've got the Northern Central, and then the Stewartstown and the New Park Fawn Grove. So if we look at each of these, we'll see the extent to which canning houses in southeastern York County are really located on these railroads. They're central to the growth of the canning industry. So we're going to look at places, canning houses at Laurel, High Rock, Muddy Creek Forks, Bridgeton, Woodbine, Southside, Castle Finn, a couple at Bryansville, and then 6 canning houses in Delta, and then Sunnyburn and Airville, which is of course up along Route 74. But you can really see that the railroad becomes the spine of this industry. The Ma and Pa, by 1907, 12% of their total freight revenue is related to the canning industry, and by 1922, 390 carloads are coming out of those canneries every year. So it's a pretty big volume coming out of that railroad. For Stewartstown, we're going to look at 3 canning houses in Stewartstown, 1 at Hungerford Station, and then the Summers Canning House down in New Freedom. This is the Stewart, or actually this is the New Park and Fawn Grove Railroad down by Wiley's Station, which was the site of one of the canning houses. And then for the New Park Fawn Grove, we're going to look at a canning house at Wiley or Wiley Station, New Park, and Fawn Grove. So again, and I'm not, there aren't any that I'm leaving out. They literally all are along the railroads. Okay, so that's the importance of the railroad. The introduction of the sanitary can. You can see there it's sanitary, it's solderless, and it's sealed. That's the important innovation here. So in the 19th century, cans were handmade and they were seamed, and that seam had to be soldered with lead-based solder. So these cans were made with lead solder. And anybody see a problem with that? Okay, so the bottoms were attached with lead solder, the tops were attached with lead solder, and then there was a hole in the top, which is how you filled the can, and then they put a little cap on it, and that was then soldered, okay? And these were done one-off, a person with a soldering iron making a can at a time. So it was a slow process, as you can imagine. Here's what that kind of donut hole can, the top of it looked like. So this would have been put on last and soldered. They came up with a slightly different version with a little smaller hole, but it still had to be lead soldered, which of course created problems. About 1890 to 1904, the sanitary can came in, and the real thing here is that it now crimps seams and you don't have to use any solder anymore. Okay, so you eliminate the problem of lead solder, and they can be made by machines. So instead of being handmade, they become machine-made. So we see the rise of companies making canning machines that both make the cans, which are then shipped to the canneries, and machines that lid the cans. so that can all be mechanized. So it really transforms the industry during that period. So we see in Baltimore companies like Continental Can Company, American Can Company, begin to sell cans in bulk. And how do they get them to southeastern Pennsylvania? On the railroad. So railroad cars full of empty cans are coming up, they're getting canned, and they're heading back to Baltimore and other urban areas. Okay, we talked about the world wars. Of course, we just passed the 100th of the end of World War I, and canned food was critical to the war effort. So here's a York Daily newspaper talking about 1,200 employed in county canneries. York leads the state with 22 factories, and canneries were considered a war asset. In fact, the article goes on to say, in case of a national conflict, one cannot conceive of warfare without a supply of food in tin cans. The canning plant is almost as important as the munitions plant. Of course, the world wars were on a scale that hadn't been imagined in terms of people and logistics. And feeding those troops was absolutely essential to an army that could win. So we had a direct impact on both of the war efforts. In this same article, they noted that there were some problems for canneries during this period. Number one was the high price of seed and fertilizer, the problem of labor, because a lot of the labor, of course, was gone overseas. And then finally, the high price of tin cans. Why were tin cans high priced during the war? Because all the metal was going to war, munitions, and production, right? So some real challenges with the wars. We see the same thing during World War II. You can see this GI in France, and he's actually got his tin can opened, sitting on a burner there. And we do have one great story from World War II, and that's about Sam Schminke, who was a local resident, and Joanna Parlett related to me. So Sam was serving in Sicily with Patton's army, and they were in the mess hall after a particularly heavy fighting, and they were sitting around on boxes of food. And so this one young guy who couldn't read very well pulls a can out and asks what it says on the label. And Sam says to the guy, he was the mess sergeant, he said, "Throw the can over here," and the guy did. And Sam announced that he was holding a can with a label that said Schanberger's Canning House, Stewartstown, Pennsylvania. So a direct link between Stewartstown canned goods and the war effort in the theater in northern Africa, which is kind of cool, right? So that's the demand of the world wars. The rise of grocery store chains and the rise of supermarkets is important too. So beginning about 1878, A&P sort of literally invented the idea of a grocery store chain, and their strategy was, their strategy was large volume, driving down cost, and standardized stores, which you see here. By 1915, they had 1,600 stores, and 15 years later, there was a 1,000% increase. So they had 16,000 stores by 1930. And what's happening here? Well, we've got urbanization going on. From 1870 to 1920, 40 million Americans left rural areas to move to the cities. And when they got to the cities, they didn't have as good a kitchen facilities, they didn't have root cellars to store things, and they found it easier to go to urban grocers like A&P to get their food. The other thing was men and women were working longer hours in the urban factories, which is what attracted them to the city in the first place, right? So by 1936, A&P opens its first supermarket, which even drives the demand higher. And what I find fascinating, by 1950, A&P was ranked second in sales in the world after General Motors. talk about the power of that supermarket chain from 1878 to 1950 is pretty incredible. Okay, so those are the sort of 4 areas of why canning and why during that time period and why Southern York County. I want to just, for those of you that may not know the canning process, the commercial canning process, just kind of really quickly give you a sense of it. So the materials come in on the receiving end, they get washed, they get sorted and graded. They may go up to a cutter depending on what kind of vegetable it was. They go to a blancher or cooker to give them a quick cook. They go into the canning filler and then go into a can sealer. They go down into heat sterilization, so they get heated high temperature under pressure. And then those hot cans, after they're sterilized, go into a water bath to cool them down. They get labeled and they get cased and they get ready to go out into the world. Okay. 2 things you should know about canning. Up to the 1860s, we didn't have a good sense of this important element called calcium chloride. Everybody know what calcium chloride is? Salt, right? And so it turns out if you put salt in water, it'll boil at a higher temperature much faster. And so at a what? Oh, at a lower temperature. Thank you. Sorry. Much quicker. So you can get up to the temperature you need, which is 240 degrees, much more quickly. So they were able to take the cooking time from 5 to 6 hours down to 25 or 40 minutes. So again, it really changed the whole process of canning. So we could go from 2,500 cans a day to 20,000 cans a day with that. The other thing that happens in 1870s is the invention of the pressure canner. So this now uses pressurized water and air heated to get that cooking going even faster. Okay? So let me just show you quickly, see if this works. Is it not going to work? There we go. Okay, I don't have any sound. So here we are filling. These are potatoes in the Pickens County Food Processing Plant. You're going to see them filling cans. We're putting salt in there, adding the water. Okay. It's a little slow. But again, it's important to see the whole process. So now they're going to start running them through that center blancher. Here they go. So they're going to get a real quick heat here. Okay. They come out the other end. They get a can lid put on the top. They're going to go to the lid sealer, which is now sealing that lid on the top. Okay. From there, they're going into what's called a crate, which is a big bin that's going to be dropped into the pressure cooker. So you can see he now has the cans. We're going into these pressure cookers that we looked at earlier. Going to be dropped into the pressure cooker. And we do have to wait for 40 minutes for it to, oh, no, not really. Okay. So it gets heated up. They get sterilized. And we will see, he actually talks a little bit about the pressure getting, the time it takes to get it up to 240 degrees, setting the timer. I think he said for 58 minutes is what they do here. And then once you get to that 58-minute period, they bleed off the pressure and they can open it up and take it to the bath, which you might be able to. I'm not seeing that. Okay, let's see. see the steam coming off. Yeah. Okay. He's going to put another group in, a very full one, into the pressure cooker, then he's going to pull one out, and you'll just get to see the water bath before it ends. Here comes one now. I don't think they had quite that kind of a lift for getting in and out during the early period, but here now it's going into the water bath, cool, and once it's cool, it's going to get labeled and boxed for shipment. Okay? So, that's the process, right? I also wanted to mention one interesting thing called the P-Viner. We actually have, this is over by Round Hill Church Road in Hickory, this building, and it had a machine in it called a P-Viner, which was used particularly when you were canning peas. That's what a P-Viner looks like. And interestingly, I was driving up 83 and I noticed a billboard attached to this thing. No, it wasn't 83. I was driving over to toward Hanover, and there was a billboard attached to this thing, and I stopped and looked, and it was a billboard attached to an old P-Viner sitting by the side of the road. And let me see if I can get this done. Here we go. P-vining in Reese, Utah. I'll just give you a quick view. So this is really an important machine to be able to, again, mechanize the process of harvesting peas. So the peas are being cut, coming out the end, and then they get picked up and go into this viner machine, which you'll see in just a second here. Okay, so now those vines that he just cut are pitchforked into the hopper and going into the P-Viner. And essentially what it's going to do then is separate out, open up the pods, and you'll get to see the inside of the operation here in a minute. It has a big drum that turns. There it is. And what you see, those little things dropping out like snowflakes, which we'll see later tonight, are peas, right? So just wait until he shows you the, so there you go. That canvas now is collecting the peas that are dropping down, and they're rolling down while the rest of the flotsam and jetsam is going up and being taken off over the top. There it is coming into the bins, so that you've got peas that are then further cleaned and are ready to can. So a pretty cool device that, again, really transformed the speed at which you could do this kind of canning operation. And actually, I know there was a P-Viner house at Summers as well, right? We'll actually see a picture of that a little bit later. So here it is, getting ready to take taking the leavings out for feed. Okay, so we'll move on. So now you've got a picture of kind of the how and the why of the canning industry, how it actually works, and I want to now just go through a few of these and give you a little bit of background on some of the canning houses. The first one we'll talk about that's farthest up the Monpas at Laurel is the York County Canning Company, which also had a cannery in York, and we know virtually nothing about it. I was not able to find out, unfortunately, much at all, except that we know there was an operation in Laurel where they were adding salt to their pack. High Rock, we know a lot more about. So Henry Manifold was the manager of the High Rock facility, and he was principally a general store merchant. And we're going to see a pattern here that many of these canneries were run by or owned by general store merchants, and we'll talk a little bit later about why that is. And he appears to have run it up to the time he died in the early 1930s. And then a guy named John Gemmel took over. He was also a general store merchant in Woodbine, and apparently he got interested in Harry Ruff's canning house, which we'll talk about in a minute, in Woodbine. He started working at High Rock probably for Mr. Manifold, and eventually by, I think, shortly after Manifold died, he's now listed as a canner in the 1940 census, so I'm guessing he took the operation over. And this canning house, we know it completely burned to the ground in the spring of 1947. Here is the cannery. You can see it here. This is the Wallace and Manifold store, the railroad. This house is all that's left of that setting there in High Rock now. Here's a good image of the whole facility. This is called the bullpen, where the raw materials were brought in, and essentially they worked their way down the process as the canning took place. We have one oral history. Janice Anderson talked about working in the High Rock factory snipping beans in 1946 to 1944 to 46. So she was there literally the year before it burned down. She made 10 cents an hour or $1 a day working snipping beans. And she tells us that her father was actually a farmer who grew beans, corn, and tomatoes for the canneries. And she talks about the bean pickers who came to the farm and actually did the harvesting for them. We have one label from High Rock, and you're going to see a lot of labels tonight, and I think these labels are themselves kind of works of art. They're really pretty extraordinary compared to the labels that we see today. This is for sugar corn, and our area was known for doing Maine-style sugar corn. I don't know the story there, but maybe we can get it from some of our canning folk here. Again, here's the High Rock Cannery with the original bullpen and another one added for the harvest coming in to be processed. We know there was a cannery in Muddy Creek Forks. We don't know much about it, except that it was built about 1903. We have a single picture of it. It's this facility here on the left, but don't know much more about it. But again, my guess is it was associated with the Grove store, which is still there at Muddy Creek Forks. The Heisons, so Robert B. Heisen in Bridgeton, and he's the one on the right here. Ended up, he originally taught school, eventually became a merchant in Gatchellville, moved to Bridgeton where he opened another store, and he added a canning house and a creamery not too long after that. This is his house and the store, and we think the cannery way here in the background. We do have a 1913 notice in the newspaper that he was building a new canning house in 1913 near the old one. It was just too small for the amount of goods he was packing in a year. So again, investing in newer and larger facilities. Here's the Bridgeton station on the Monpah. A couple of his labels. He canned under the Heisen brand, as you might imagine, and his product was tender and sweet. So there you go. I thought this was a really interesting label, and for those of you that were at my talk on the Indian Steps Museum, I was really interested in this imagery of Native Americans and thinking that there might be a relationship there, but now I know that this is actually just a standard label that they would buy and add their name to. Woodbine, we had Harry Ruff was again started as a merchant, began canning about 1911, and cans all the way up until, and in fact, his death certificate lists him as a canner of beans and sugar corn, not to be too precise, and that he had been doing it for 26 years, so we get a lot of good information on that. probably this guy Clarence Snyder takes over for him. And Clarence Snyder is the son of Thomas Snyder, who runs one of the other big canning companies in Delta that we'll look at. The census is kind of interesting because he becomes a painter and paperer and a bunch of other things. But he's clearly canning because we have labels for C.E. Snyder in Woodbine. So we definitely know he's running a canning firm during that period. We also have this one from Woodbine, and I'm assuming the Well Don might be two different names that are sort of being put together. Or it's a like well done. I don't know what's going on there, and I don't know who the third generation is.
Weldon Ruff.
What? Is it Weldon Ruff?
Yes, that was his first name.
There we go. Great, thank you. Okay, that mystery solved it for me. Good. And here is Woodbine. There's the canning plant with the smokestack in the background. Thomas Snyder, who had operations in Delta, Bryansville, Castle Finn, Southside, so the whole southern part of the Montauk. He, unlike the others, wasn't a merchant originally. He was a farmer and got into this as a farmer and ran these operations. Again, some really beautiful labels thanks to the Ma and Pa Society. All of these Thomas Snyders, Castle Finn, Southside. And then Roy Snyder and Donald Snyder. So Roy was Thomas's son, and Donald is Roy's son. So there's a long family tradition here. So we think the firm starts about 1887, and he's listed as a canner or canning factory operator all the way up into the 1930s. By 1960, Roy's son Donald is running it. And in 1960, not only they are packing tomatoes and corn, but they're packing hominy and pork and beans. And they talk in one of the things I read about adding those because otherwise canning was very seasonal. And by canning pork and beans and hominy, they could do that sort of year round, and it kept the factory in operation more regularly. Here's a 1935 image of that cannery in Sunnyburn. And there's Mr. Snyder, that's Roy Snyder. And what I also love is this guy down in the front, and he's showing their products, right? He's got corn in one hand and tomato in another. Looks like something out of a John Steinbeck. Anyways, so he's packing, it's called Packer's Pride. I also like this one with this little guy shoving a tomato into the can, which I think is kind of special. He also did canning under the Castle Finn brand. And this was interesting. So we actually have one of his orders from 1922 to the Southern Can Company in Baltimore, Maryland. And it's important to note, so he's buying empty cans, an entire carload. So it had 20,000 number 3 cans, 400 cases, number 3s balanced, and number 2s. So this is a huge number of machine-made cans being brought up, and he essentially turns around and ships it back to Baltimore for sale. And here's Roy on the left, and his son Donald on the right with a bunch of their cans of pork and beans. Does anybody remember Snyder's pork and, oh, okay. Wow. Anybody have one of those cans? You do? Okay, I gotta talk to you after. Great. So on the Stewartstown Railroad, of course, we have Stewartstown, Hungerford, and New Freedom. In Stewartstown, probably the earliest canning house, it's listed as P. Gable and Son, but in all of my research, I cannot find a P. Gable, so I think it should have been B. Gable, Benson Gable, who was a farmer. And by 1887, Benson Gable had one son, so B. Gable and Son, I think probably makes some sense. But we do have that reference in 1888. James Jordan is also listed in 1888 as canning, but we have other references as early as 1879 that he's canning. And he dies in 1895, keep that in mind, when we go to the next canner, who is David Eady. And David Eady starts canning down in Norrisville, and lo and behold, in 1895, he moves to Stewartstown. And I think he moves his cannery and takes over the cannery of Jordan, who dies in 1895. And he becomes a canner and stays a canner up until about 1903, when the cannery is taken over by his son-in-law, George Devilbiss, and his wife, Laura. And Laura is David's daughter. So it's a kind of all in the family thing with canning. So the next cannery that many people will recognize, George Devilbiss. He actually was educated at Western Maryland College. He taught there for quite a few years, and then he went on to teach in Fawn Grove at the Academy in Fawn Grove. And it appears that he got into canning when his father-in-law retired in 1903, and he took over the canning house from his father-in-law, David Eady. And he ran that up through the Great Depression, at which point he lost both the canning house and his interest in the furniture factory, which he had a part in. He died shortly thereafter in 1935. This is his house down in the lower corner. We do have some newspaper notices of him. He's now listing acreage of corn. He'll pay $10 per ton. And he notes, I decided not to pack tomatoes this season. If it was like this year, I can understand why he didn't pack tomatoes, right, with all the rain. And then also, this other one is interesting because I had heard that we didn't pack fruit in this area, that it was just vegetables. But in fact, he talks about he's expecting to can apples shortly. So clearly there was some fruit packing going on as well. And this case that you see on the left actually is in the collection of the Stewartstown Historical Society, came from the railroad. And I was on eBay one day and found this can on eBay. It's been opened, don't worry. But you'll see George Devilbiss, and again, it's his favorite brand of sugar corn. And what was really cool, when I turned it over, on the back, what does that say? Sanitary Can Company, 1898 to 1904, right? And you can see that whoever had this, and I think I got it from somewhere out in the Midwest, had quite an interesting can opener to get this thing open. And inside, when I popped it open, there was actually a photograph that the person that sold it to me didn't even know about. So I'm still trying to figure that out. But that's another story. Okay, so after Devilbiss passes in 1935, Charles, and I know it's pronounced differently, but here Schanbarger, right, born 1904, he takes it over in about 1937. But interestingly, I found out in 1930, he was working as a truck driver at a cannery in Fawn Grove, probably for James T. Smith, who was the Fawn Grove canner. So he had kind of come into it through that way. He continued to operate it, obviously, well into the 20th century. By 1954, he was hiring about 100 employees during the canning season, many of them women, so providing work for women in the town, along with, of course, the sewing factories and other things. He was not a merchant, but he was a farmer. So he owned multiple farms, so this was a case where the canning operation was really helping him turn his farm products into more valuable products. He did have migrant labor on the farms. He hired Polish women that came from Baltimore to work in the cannery. And it noted that one of his biggest assets is a splendid artesian well, which provides ample water, which I haven't been able to find out much about. We do have a great oral history from Ken Willward. He talks about in the spring of 1963, he dropped out of school to get a job at Schanbarger's farm and canning house. At the time, they would contract with local farmers to farm so many acres of corn, beans, tomatoes. Dad and Grandpa would always plant 15 to 20 acres of corn for the cannery. Lots of farmers grew corn and beans, but for tomatoes, Schanbarger grew most of them himself on his own farms. When harvest time came, it was busy, and one thing was certain: if wet weather hit and some corn got too old, Schanbarger would never let the farmer be stuck with it. He would take that corn out, shred it, put it in the silos for his cattle. And he notes that he owned several farms, the best of which was the Hall Farm, which many of us know about. Most of the goods would be going for government contracts and were loaded and shipped on the railroads. And he notes that the pay was not very much back in that time. This is 1963. I made 45 cents an hour to start, right? Okay. Here's a couple of images. So this is 1954. Of course, now, what's located there? Yeah, exactly, Dollar General. Here he is. So he's, the woman on the left is Charlotte Kreider, who was the secretary, bookkeeper. From all I can tell, she really ran the place. Then there's Charles, his wife Ethel, and Roy Arnold, who was their foreman in 1954. This is the bean snipper machines, again in 1954. And Norman Bush, who I think, did he just died recently? Yeah. So he provided us in 2014 a note, said, "We canned beans, corn, and tomatoes in number 10 cans. Men would go out in the field and pick the beans. We had 2 bean picking machines. They pulled wagons behind them. They would dump them on the truck. They would bring that to the canning house and dump it on the floor. They had 7 bean snipper machines, which had round drums that had holes in them, and they had knives on the side." So that's what we're seeing here. The beans would go into the holes and snip the ends off, and then they would go on the belt to the blancher, and then go to the filling table and be put in cans. Then they would go to the long heated box to the capper. Then they would go in a crate to the cooker, the pressure cooker. Then he talks about them being taken out, put on skids, and put into the warehouses. They put 68 cans to a case, in this case, and I took them on a skid to the warehouse. So another one of our local stories. Here, tomatoes being unloaded. And here are tomatoes being processed on something called a merry-go-round, which went around, and the women were kind of working to skin the tomatoes and get them ready to go into the cans. Here they are unloading corn, going up into a hopper to be processed. And then, not only Schanbarger's, but also Smith and Summers had facilities for the seasonal workers, particularly ones that came from some distance. So what you're seeing here are the employee housing for the Polish residents that came up starting in the 1940s. This is a great painting by Bill Faulkner of that facility. Here are some of those women, and the women over here, these are mostly the Polish women that are coming up from Baltimore, and they're actually coming from the Locust Point neighborhood. And we have one, this is the last oral history here. This is Barbara Ann Polomsky Allen. And she says, "My grandmother, Catherine Polomsky, and my aunt, Stella Pomroff, were one of the first women to work for Mr. Schanbarger. Polish people were very hard workers, in the field early in the morning until late at night. When storms came, we were soaked and hid in the woods or the barn nearby. The ladies skinned tomatoes until their poor hands were raw, and I'm not sure, but I think it was 20 cents a bucket. They did corn also. There were some nice local ladies that skinned tomatoes there, and most of them respected the Polish women. I well remember Stewartstown and will until I die. I went to grandmother Bobush for one day. I went with grandmother Bobush from day one until I was 18 years old, and now miss it. We used to walk the track, swim under the bridge. We couldn't wait for payday just to get the famous chocolate marshmallow peanut sundae at the ice cream parlor. She says, what memories. Mr. and Mrs. Hammer, Bob Hammer's parents, were good to us. They gave us book trade, which I take to mean credit. And then at payday, my grandmother always paid the Hammers. We enjoyed the dime store across from the bank. Our biggest treat, and when we knew that the bean season was over, Mr. Schanbarger would send trucks out with pints of ice cream and drinks, and us kids were happy. My grandmother passed away at 85. She had been down there that year. She said she came home and she passed that same year after visiting Stewartstown. I'm now 67, and like I said, I will always love Stewartstown. It was part of my life. Mr. Schanbarger, Miss Charlotte, and his wife had the courtesy to come to Baltimore when my grandmother passed. They thought that much of her. Thank you for all the Polish people. They came from Locust Point, Broadway at the beginning. So a really neat story of this connection to immigrant families in Baltimore. And here's just a couple of other pictures. They're not the greatest images. So we moved from Stewartstown to Hungerford, and this packing house is run first by Albert Rehmeyer, and then by a man named William Free, as far as I can tell. And we found this medallion online, Hungerford Packing USDA Certified Cannery. So this is noting that after the Pure Food and Drug Act, that they were certified and that they weren't using any additives in their canned goods, which became an important issue. We have some documents showing Albert Rehmeyer as the packer from 1928. These are sort of his jottings on buying from somebody 3,970 pounds of beans, etc., etc. And also a tomato statement for Ralph Haynes, who I believe was related to you, Doug, right? Yes. Yeah. So this was his sales piece. June 1951. Again, you can see the number of women employed at the packing house. In 1944, they won the Achievement A Award for the war effort, and each of them got one of these little envelopes that say, don't open until June the 10th, right? How many people didn't open their envelope? But what was inside was this wonderful pin, and it certifies that they're authorized to wear the War Food Administration A Award. Your accomplishments on the food production front as a worker are recognized by the War Food Administration as being a significant contribution to victory. And of course, on the back, a note from our president, Franklin Roosevelt: food is a decisive weapon of war. So it really ties the importance of the canning and food industry into the war effort at that time. I'm going to skip over this kind of quickly, but this is somebody who is riding on the railroad in 1945, and he talks about going by the cannery in Hungerford with a sign, they're packing tomatoes today, and he picked up 2 cars to take over to the Pennsylvania in New Freedom. The Stewartstown was doing its job for national defense, and he just wished the British would be able to meet the friendly Dutch farmers who raised all that good food and sent it along on its way across the sea. And by 1955, they were using the York County Dutch brand, and they were really known for their onions. This is a Life magazine ad from 1961, York County Dutch onions. They're guaranteed to leave no onion breath, which is, I think, an important feature, right? Okay. Charles Summers, New Freedom, and this is a picture from, I believe, about the 1950s. They canned mainly under the Superfine brand. Just a kind of timeline, so the firm started in 1865 down in Maryland, moved from Jessup to Baltimore, and in 1923 they moved up to New Freedom and opened an operation there. In 1932, all of the operation was moved to New Freedom, and that same year the entire operation burned down. Within a year they rebuilt the plant and continued to expand from there, so that by 1965 it covered 10 acres, had 30,000 square feet of production and 100,000 square feet of storage, and in 1984 they were sold to the Hanover Brands, which was Weinbrenner Canning in Hanover.
No, there were two canneries in Hanover.
Oh.
Hanover Brands and Weinberg.
Oh, okay, were they the other one? Okay.
Hanover Brands is still
Thanks.
operating.
Are they? Okay. This is just a list of the presidents. Interesting here is that this would have been your mother, right?
Yes.
Yeah, actually was the president of the cannery from 1951 after her husband died up until the 1960s when you took over. And Thomas Jr., who's here with us tonight, remembers as a 13 or 14-year-old working next to the German POWs who were helping provide labor both at the cannery and in the fields, not only for Summers but for some of the other canneries. Here's a map of the Summers operation. If we just kind of come in a little bit closer, and you'll get to see, so there's the P-Viner building at the cannery, and down here is, again, one of these areas where the workers during the seasonal period could actually bunk and have cookhouses and the like at the cannery. This is their label under the superfine 1940s, and a very long list of products that they canned during that period, including okra, my favorite. Okay. Back to the last rail head, the New Park to Fawn Grove. So we have Wiley, New Park, and Fawn Grove. Wiley Station, James T. Smith was running the canning house there, beginning in about 1914. He started the cannery there. Move on from that. So we have a Stewartstown News where it announces that he's starting there, and it said he already has canneries at Pilesville, Fawn Grove, and New Park. So he has a big operation going at that point. Here's the cannery. The cannery is actually these buildings that we see in this picture. In New Park, James Smith as well is running the canning house in New Park starting in about 1906. And he appears to be running it with a guy named L.P. Colgan, who we'll hear from here, who is also another Harford County canner who came up into PA. And then by the 1950s, that canning house was being run by Weinbrenner out of Hanover, who were canning under the Dutch treat label. Here's the canning house. This is about 1935, we think, and notice on the smokestack it says L.P. Colgan here. And we have one of these tokens. Many of the canneries were paying or providing tokens as an accounting system for the workers. And I think we've got the display in the back. We can learn a little bit more about those as well. Here it is in 1933, and a couple of the labels, both the New Park Challenge and I guess his son was named Dick. I don't know where we're going to go on that one, but anyways, let's move right on to this photo of the canning house in 1935. And interestingly, we have 6 of the canning houses in southern York County that are photographed the same week as this. So there must have been somebody traveling around taking images of the canning houses, because they're all within a day or two of each other. Again, large number of women, young women, and older women who are working at the canning house. I think this is Mr. Smith and Mr. Colgan, who are sitting right in the front row of that picture. Okay, now, this is the special part. Here you go. So here is a late 1950s, early 1960s image of the canning house at Zoo Park that was done in Super 8, in a Super 8 movie that was converted. It was done by Gene Miller. So he's out there harvesting the corn. This goes on for a little too long, and I can't move it ahead because of the way that the system's working. And nice goose. There's all kinds of good wildlife here in this picture. You see the countryside down around New Park. There's the cows.
That's actually outside of Fong Grove,
Oh, is it?
off Mitchell Road.
Okay.
That's like where I grew up.
Oh, fantastic. Wow. So we
My
can,
dad's Gmail.
okay. So there you go. That's, he's actually taking the image, right?
Pardon?
He's taking,
He took the picture.
yeah. Yeah, I don't know how he did these, because it gets a little. Is he now a filmmaker, or did he become a filmmaker? Okay, there we go. So you've seen enough
So it's,
harvesting. That's a farm all, by the
You
way.
had a rough one.
Yeah.
That's a sweet corn picker.
Right.
It didn't have a husking bed, that's a very special machine.
That's
Yeah.
Cliff Few, I know the driver. Cliff Few.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
This is great. So any minute now,
That's pretty cool.
They'll start.
Not Joe, Kayla.
John Deere there. These wagons that they're going into are really quite interesting. You'll get to see how that works here in just a second. Okay. I couldn't believe it when I found out we actually had this video. It's just, thank you for sharing it with us. Okay, come on. I think we've done the harvest. Okay, here we go. Now we're gonna see how this thing dumps. It's quite something. The truck gets there just in time. There we go. Okay. That's quite an operation. Yeah, and this is another version of it here.
Somebody's name on it, I can't make that.
Yeah, I couldn't make out on the truck the name of it. It might be Colgan, I'm not sure. Okay, great trucks.
That would be D. Weinbrenner there.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, Joe Smith, okay.
Okay, now we're going to the canning house. Yeah. And they're gonna just dump it?
Oh, this is pretty modern, Hope.
Yeah.
This is the cement.
Yeah, it's 50.
Towards the end.
They even had a dump truck.
Now he's pushing it into the conveyor.
Oh, there's the old house.
That's where the husk is going back out to the
Right.
truck.
Heck, I might be-
So it's getting husked.
We did that, oh, yeah.
Okay. Great cars.
That's your dad.
That's my dad.
Charlie Shank.
Yep,
Aw.
checking out the corn.
There you go. See, it's going into the,
On the conveyor belt, going into the husker
Yeah.
machine.
okay,
That's
just checking it out.
That's USDA inspector.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's Patsy Boone.
And now here's the women inside.
That's the, coming off the husker.
Right.
And that's,
They're sorting,
they're cutting the bad.
cutting and, cutting out bad
spots.
spots.
Taking worms
right?
out and stuff.
And those are the colors.
That's terrible.
Oh, they had the new cutters, this is pretty late.
It's like mid-60s. And those are the cobs coming in. There's the corn down at the bottom coming over
Yeah.
the conveyor.
Coming out
That's
of
where it's going into the cutters.
That's really cool, I didn't even know.
Oh, there you go.
And then that's going up, and it
That's a,
goes. in-
that's a silker there.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a
It
silver.
takes the silk off.
And then it goes in the shaker to the right, and then goes up, and then that's where the lady's picking.
Final inspection.
Picking out
Final
the-
inspection.
before it goes into
That's my
the-
grandmother on the right.
There it is in the canners.
That's the filler.
There's
Yeah,
my grandmother.
fillers.
She was watching to make sure everything had a lid on it.
Yeah,
And that's the inspector.
Yeah.
opening a can and making sure it's all looking good.
That's, Duke, Chester Duke.
And that's in, they're putting the empty cans on the conveyor to go in,
To the
They're
filler.
headed to the factory to get filled, yeah.
Yeah,
Down the back lines.
and then that's coming back out, and that's where they're putting it in.
they're boxing. There's the whole process, right in New Park.
Here's a load going out.
Yep. Okay,
They would run about 100,000 cases a year there. Right around that,
that's a lot of corn.
at that time.
That's a lot of corn. Here's the group, and this is 1951 at this operation. By then, Weinbrenner is running it.
I thought it was in one of those pictures.
And then in Fawn Grove, James Smith again is running it, and really runs it well up, and he's in his 90s when he dies and continues there. Again, 70 to 100 employees seems about right. He owns 20 to 25 farms in addition to the canning house. This is the Fawn Grove Canning House, and we actually had somebody that worked there who labeled it for us. So again, we can see the bullpen, the husker and the husking chute, then going over into the cutters, conveyor, door to the conveyor belt, and then storage for processed corn. And if we move to the other side, the fillers and cappers, the cookers in the back end, the boiler room, and they noted that Jake Birkin shoveled coal to produce the steam, and then of course the scale house, which we saw as well. And based on the cars, I'm guessing this is the first, maybe the 30s, something like that. Here's that group in 1935, again, 2 days later than we saw the other image. And I think, again, this is Mr. Smith right here in the front row. Okay, so last thing I wanted to do was just talk about this idea of labor shortage and World War II. So the Stewartstown POW camp opened in June of 1944. It only operated the 2 years, 44 and 45. These prisoners came from the main POW camp, which was up at Fort Indian Town Gap. That was the closest one. There were actually 14 camps in Pennsylvania. There were about 2,000 POWs at the camp. And Charlie Summers, I guess that would have been your grandfather, right?
My father was the one who basically, Charles Summers was my grandfather, but
Right.
my father was the one who helped build the camp.
Helped build the camp. But I think your grandfather, from what I was reading, it said that he was kind of struggling with labor and figuring out what he was going to do. And he learned that there may be POWs available during that time to help. And Stewartstown offered up the fairgrounds to construct the camp so that labor could be brought in specifically for the canning industry. I have this kind of a long quote, but and actually it's from Jim McClure's piece. but Robert Schaub, who talked about remembering the German prisoners toiling in the fields near his family farm. He was told not to talk to the men. His father would drive to the camp, get a group of prisoners, and take them back to the farm where they would do the harvest that would then go to the prisoner of war camp. And I know, Mr. Summers, you talked about actually picking up prisoners and taking them to the plant itself, right, where they helped
Yes.
with processing. And you guarded them, right?
There was a guard that came along with them.
Okay,
They knew they had a good thing going here, and the guard, then they went down on the cases and went to sleep during the day.
excellent, excellent. This is a drawing from 1944 of the camp. We've got a couple of images of what the camp, it was only a summertime camp, or into the fall. So it really was very seasonal, just like the production. And we even have some letters from Charles Summers. In this case, it's to the, he's working for this group called the Stewartstown Canners Association, which I think was a kind of conglomerate of the canners who then worked with the government to hire these workers who were paid, they were paid, I think, about, 75 cents a day to the prisoners. I think that's, here it's 45 cents. 45 cents per hour, actually. And that the prisoners could then, which seems kind of high, but that's
It was the same thing that the average person was making per day, too. They were paid on the same basis.
same basis, yeah. Okay, so we kind of went through, talked about the growth of the canning industry and the kind of reasons, and then finally I just wanted to reinforce this, that there were essentially two kinds of owner-operators of canning houses. One was merchants who owned stores, and they added canning houses for some very obvious reasons, because they could pay the farmers and the workers in store credit, which thereby guaranteed them customers, right? So it sort of created this connection that for them turned out to be a really very positive thing in terms of making money. The other kinds of owners were farmers who themselves owned a lot of farms, a lot of acreage, and they were then able to really add value to their crop by having a canning house. And we talked about labor. Of course, it provided women with seasonal opportunities to get out of the home and begin to work and provide income to farm families. It was really getting more difficult to make ends meet through farming. And there was also, it allowed them to really enter the kind of consumer culture with the rise of places like Montgomery Ward's and Sears catalogs, to begin to have the money to buy things that they were hoping to have. And that's the end. Thank you. Comments or questions, or?
I'm going to start this around, we always take a free will offering so that we can give something to the church for letting us be here, and so.
Yeah.
I don't know if